The agenda this week explored better ways to deal with plastics, got advice on how to avoid burnout in the workplace, and asked Booker Prize-winning author Marlon James about his epic new novel. The agenda's Week in Review begins, assessing Canada's foreign policy in a shifting global order. It's been reported that the Premier of China has refused to speak with Justin Trudeau. Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Affairs Minister, has been refused communications with China's Foreign Minister. It's unlikely, apparently, that Prime Minister Trudeau is going to get any FaceTime with Xi Jinping at the upcoming G20 meeting in Osaka later this week. So, wrap it all up for us. Put a bow on it. What does this say about our diplomatic options right now?
I think it says two things. First, it says something about the way China views Canada, which is that we aren't a really significant power, and as a result, given that they aren't going to change their mind, there's no need to humor us by granting us these meetings. It's just a reminder that we're at a different level according to the Chinese. For us, I think it does say that there is one thing we can do, and it's remind all the other Western liberal democracies out there who are at the same level in China's eyes as we are, that this could also happen to them.
Who would that be?
This is our NATO allies. This is our Five Eyes partners. These are our EU associates. Just remind them that they should be objecting to the treatment of Canadians, because next time it might not be us who faces these things. And the Chinese have shown to be sensitive to global criticism, to criticism from multiple countries. They don't really care if Canada is upset. But when it's a group of countries, particularly they do economic business with, they're a little bit more sensitive to that.
So to our allies, ease up on the schadenfreude, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when we complain, hopefully there can be others that complain with us. We shouldn't be complaining alone. It just reminds the world that we aren't that powerful on our own.
Well, I'll pick up on that word alone, because, Gary, I'll bring you in on this. The Canadian historian Robert Bothwell said, "We have never been this alone. We don't have any serious allies." And I think that's another factor in what the Chinese are doing. Our means of retaliation are very few. That's Robert Bothwell's position on this. What do you say?
Well, look, foreign policy is an evolving situation, and I don't think we're completely alone in the world. The reality is the situation has changed over the years. The size of China, the growth of China on the world stage. It's great to advocate for other countries to speak up for us on this case, as the case was made. The reality is, in a lot of cases, other countries look at their situation with China and say, "Oh, yeah, you make a good point, but maybe we for our own interests, we're going to stay quiet on this." I thought it was indicative when the Twitter spat was raised with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Canada went looking for allies to speak out on its behalf. I thought that was actually quite shocking and surprising, that a lot of what we would consider our natural allies, all of a sudden they couldn't take our call, or they weren't really available. So
interesting. Can I get Michael to follow up on that, actually? Michael, follow up on that one point. Is there anybody else out there, allies of ours, as Adam says, who are going to bat for us right now with the Chinese?
Well, we have lots of allies who are concerned about this. Look at Australia, look at New Zealand, France, Germany. There are lots of middle powers who share our concern. But I would also like to suggest that losing the protection of a consistently reliable United States might actually be good for Canada, and that it's forcing us to think for ourselves for a change, to stand up for ourselves. It's really difficult to develop an independent foreign policy and to develop all of the capacities that we didn't used to need. But in the long term, I think this could be good for Canada and Canadian foreign policy to relieve ourselves of our dependence on one large neighbor and to find our own way in the world.
Besma, Robert Bothwell also said China is a hostile power. Do you think he's right about that?
It's certainly, I think, not, let's call it a frenemy. It's a friend, but it's also got adversarial undertones. I mean, we have to keep in mind here that there are a lot of things that do bind us. Clearly, of course, I think trade is one matter, a huge diaspora community here. I mean, there's lots of things that keep us connected as well. But, I think it is a rising power that seeing how it's increasingly going into surveillance technology, increasingly, frankly, afraid of its image abroad. The whole consolidation that's happening behind Xi inside the country are all worrying signs. I mean, there is a nationalist populist discourse, even in China, around the Communist Party that is worrying. And I think that we're going to see certainly a more emboldened China out there. And I think, Australia, as Michael pointed out, is certainly feeling that they're the one that often pay most of the price of that kind of emboldenedness that we see in China. But I don't think we can escape it either. And we really have to sort of walk this very fine line. I don't think we can completely ignore the fact that we do have a strong, necessary relationship with the Americans that will always hopefully back us. But, of course, this is a Trump administration that is just unorthodox all the time. And, that traditional backing us up is just not working this time around.
Michael, would you associate yourself with Bob Bothwell's comments that China is now a hostile power?
China is just a very different country from Canada. It has a different governing system. It has a very different history. I wouldn't say that it's an enemy, but it's certainly a country that we have to try to understand and try to work with while being very cautious. This is not a country that we can trust. But that's not a new challenge for international diplomacy. We made it through the Cold War, faced with a Soviet Union that had thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles pointed at North America. We can get through these things, and look, even while we were standing off against the Soviet Union, we were finding ways to partner with them in some things. There was a moment when American and Russian astronauts actually met in orbit and shook hands at the height of the Cold War. So, no, there's always a way forward.
In Canada, 3.84 million tons of plastic is generated every year. Only 11 to 12% of that is collected for recycling, and even less is actually recycled. Okay, let's get into this. Sarah, it seems that Canadians are waking up to the fact that our recycling system is not quite what we thought it was. So let's compare and contrast here. What do you think the general sense among Canadians about how effective our recycling programs is?
I definitely think that people were quite shocked to learn that, most of what they're putting in the blue bin isn't actually being recycled. Definitely just in talking with friends and family, people really try their best to sort, clean, put things in the right places. And yeah, I think they were really disappointed and shocked actually to learn that despite best efforts, we're really not living up to this recycling ideal that we had set for ourselves. So yeah.
Given that you're right there on an ocean, maybe you can tell us how much of what we think we're recycling actually ends up in an ocean.
Yeah, well, in terms of scale of the problem, about a garbage truck worth of plastic is entering our oceans every single minute. So, while we're having this discussion today, there will be at least the equivalent of, 20 to 30 garbage trucks worth of plastic. So the problem is, has reached a crisis level. In terms of what we're actually seeing when we do shoreline cleanups, when we're out at sea, of course, quite a lot of the plastic that enters our oceans actually falls to the sea floor. But what we see in cleanups and what washes up on beaches are things like bottles, bottle caps, food wrappers, things like straws. And then, of course, microplastics, so things that have been broken down a lot into a lot of different pieces, styrofoam, a number of types of plastics that are known as single-use plastics.
Usman, let me get you in the discussion now. How did we get into a situation where so little of our plastics are being recycled and so little of what we are collecting and think we are recycling is being recycled?
So in fact, plastics are ubiquitous. They're in your cell phone, they're in your car, they're in the textiles, in your carpet, they're in your curtains, they're in our clothing. So plastics are everywhere. And of that, 3.4 to 3.8 million tons of plastics out there, we're only recycling 9%. That 9% actually, a lot of what is being recycled is actually coming from our residential recycling systems. So we've got bottle deposit programs across the country that collect your plastic bottles. We've got curbside recycling that's collecting it. Some of what's being collected in your residential systems being exported to developing countries. So a huge chunk of the plastic in our economy is not being addressed through recycling systems. And so it ends up being disposed of or thrown in the landfill.
Joanne, maybe I can get you on that too. How is it that so little of what we think we're recycling is actually getting recycled?
Yeah, I think to build on Usman's point, what we now know is 40% of what's being put onto the marketplace that actually attributes or contributes to the plastic problem is actually in packaging. And in fact, 50% of that 40% is designed to be single use. So part of the major problem is, what are we putting onto the marketplace, and what are the alternatives for consumers as it relates to making better choices?
So a circular economy is where you have the manufacturer of a product designs the product to be collected and reused or recycled, sets up systems to do that. That material then goes back to companies like Green Mantra, where the plastics is then recycled back into new products, and it flows back into the economy.
So the point is not to end up in a landfill somewhere.
Exactly, and to recover those hydrocarbons, those resources in plastic for consistent reuse again and again in productive cycles. And the next step would be to start producing plastics differently rather than producing them from fossil fuels or fossil resources like natural gas, but start producing them using renewable chemistries. When you bring those together, you've got a low carbon plastic system that's zero waste. And that's really what we're aspiring to.
When we look at, again, burnout, the loss of energy and the fatigue, very different from, for example, clinical depression or other anxiety disorders. These are, so the exhaustion here from burnout is it's very separate. It's also accompanied by insomnia or this immense difficulty to even recover. But when we look at also burnout overall, it's a sense of loss. It's a sense of loss in so many areas of our life. It's interesting because a lot of research also has found how there are especially loss in our personal resources that could lead to increased risk for burnout. So for example, participation or skill utilization or professional worth. So for example, participation, do we feel that we are able to participate in some key decisions that might be going on in our organization? Skill utilization, do we perceive that we are able to use a variety of skills to be able to do our work and our responsibilities? And most importantly, professional worth, do we feel that our work is recognized, is being valued, and most importantly, do I feel that my work is consistent with the organizational goal? Because as soon as we lose this, there's also this reward that we are losing, and it also comes to job insecurity as well.
Well, let me share a bunch of words here with you, and you tell me if these are basically all different sides of the same cube, because they may be used interchangeably. Burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, depression. What's the relationship here?
They're all related. So I think this is important to know. They're all related. And certainly burnout is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing event. It's a progression. And certainly it can increase the risk for psychological disorders, so such as clinical depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc., but also physical health problems. And there's also an overlap between physical health and mental health as well. Now, it's also possible to suffer from a mental health condition, psychological disorder, concurrent with burnout. And of course, burnout can just contribute to the exacerbation in chronicity and make recovery even more prolonged. What's also very interesting throughout research is really when we look at key organizational, as she also very greatly discussed, when we look at key organizational stressors, so for example, a role within organization, supervisory relationship, organizational structure and climate, rewards, or stressors intrinsic to the job, we can see how all of those, more or less, or sometimes one component more than the other, can also increase the risk for burnout.
I'm going to read something now, Rahaf, that the American psychiatrist Richard A. Friedman wrote about burnout in the New York Times, and then I'll get you to react to it after I finish reading this excerpt from his piece. When a disorder is reportedly so widespread, it makes me wonder whether we are at risk of medicalizing everyday distress. If almost everyone suffers from burnout, then no one does, and the concept loses all credibility. Of course, we must do all we can to detect and treat serious mental illness, like depression and drug and alcohol abuse. But let's not medicalize everyday stress and discomfort as burnout. Okay, you want to react to that?
I mean, for me, I took the opposite view when I saw how global this epidemic was. It signified to me not that, everyone is, not that it reflects that we're minimizing someone's mental conditions, but actually the opposite, that the systems that we have created around work, and my research particularly focuses on creative work and knowledge work, that if so many people are signaling that they are in distress, then to me that is a huge red flag that we as a society and that organizations themselves and leadership teams need to actually start looking at the design of the system, the cultures of the organization. And that is, I think, a conversation that we need to be having more. It worries me to see people dismiss it, because I know that when I was experiencing my own burnout, you feel ashamed. We have a culture where hard work is a symbol of your ability to own your role, of your ability to do a good job. And so if you can't do that job, if you can't hustle hard enough, you feel a lot of shame, because people tell you, or the message that you get culturally is that it's your fault, that you're not working hard enough. You just need a better system. You just need inbox zero. You just need a different framework, instead of actually saying, wait a minute, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we're structuring and designing cultural and the way that we're talking about work within our everyday lives.
Do you share any of your American colleagues' concerns about this?
So here's the thing. When we talk about mental health, the importance of mental health promotion, prevention, we're talking about primary prevention, anything that we do prior to an onset of an illness. Secondary prevention is anything we can help to reduce the onset, certainly minimizing the symptoms whenever there is an onset of an illness.
In your acknowledgement, you actually write that my mother is allowed to read all but 2 pages of this book. Why is that, and what are those 2 pages?
So there's a running, in all my books, there's sort of a running gag in all the acknowledgements about what my mother is allowed to read. The first one said to my mother, who should not be allowed to read this book. So now she can read 2, but I think there's some really intimate goings on. So my mom is a very devout church lady. So that might be too much.
And the goings on are between men.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me reading this book, it was very casual about it. It wasn't, out of the ordinary.
Yeah, but Africa has this, an African continent, not African continent, some countries in the continent have this reputation for homophobia, which I thought was really interesting. Because nobody talks about the role in which the evangelical church, American evangelical church, plays into that. That from the research I found, things like queerness, gayness, and so on was stuff that was already accepted and absorbed into all these various African societies from before, which is very shocking and affirming to hear.
What did it mean to you to find that out as a gay man?
Well, it meant that far from what I've been told, that it's sort of an aberration or even something that some disease we got infected with by Europeans, that queerness, otherness, transness has always been part of so much of the African framework. When we talk about warriors who were trusted with brides to be because everybody knew they were gay, so nothing was going to happen. That society is, and it's not to say that that societies were like wholly accepted queerness and so on, but they realized the role those people played. And for me to realize that, I didn't expect to go to the past to find validation. I thought in the present and hope for the future, maybe we'll be less homophobic, blah, 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 blah. But to find out that we actually were less before.
So it's affirming.
It's affirming.
What I found interesting, though, was, with that being said, there is still homophobia. There are still people in the book who are excommunicated from their families because they're gay.
Yeah.
Why have that if this is the world that you're imagining and creating? Why still have homophobia?
Well, because hate is old too, and prejudice is old too. And I didn't want to. I didn't want to go make an arrow in either way, saying everything was fantastic. But what I think wasn't there is this sort of stateside or religion-side endorsement of hate.
But religion does come up a little bit. The characters have this thing where they say "F the gods," and it goes through, the book. When you're writing something, is this something that you're struggling with too?
So in a way, sometimes I think when the thing that Tracker probably says is most like me is when he says, "I don't believe in belief." Which that is what I'm struggling. I think I struggle with not necessarily religion, but the need for it.
What does that mean? I don't believe in.
I don't believe in belief. That to have belief as a system, to have faith as a system, as opposed to knowledge or certainty or so on. To put trust in other things, in institutions at the expense of your own intelligence or common sense. And I'm not saying these are bad things, but I'm saying that I personally know I'm in a sort of a permanent limbo with all of that. I don't think I'd ever call myself an atheist. I'm way too cowardly for that.
But what would that mean, coming from a family, having a mother who is a devout believer?
But she also became a devout believer later in her years. I don't know if she was questioning before, but I also came out of that. I came out of church, and I went to church. I joined church pretty late. I joined church in my late 20s.
But did you join church because you were trying to run away from who you knew to
Oh,
yourself
absolutely,
to be?
absolutely. I ended up finding more than that in church. I actually did find community, and there are things about church which I think people, need to recognize that in a lot of communities all over the world, church is the glue that holds it together. But I had bigger questions, and especially in a church that was very unintellectual. So the whole idea of questions is just anathema to it. And I'm just not, I'm not crazy about dogma, and I'm not crazy about anti-intellectualism.
You want to ask questions?
I want to ask questions. They don't have to be answered, but I think we should at least consider them.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, June 28th, 2019. All of those conversations are available on our website, that's tvo.org, on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/theagenda, and on our Twitter feed, that's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.